Support for Lab Out Loud is brought to you by the National Science Teachers Association. Find out more at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And today we're continuing our three-part series on place-based education with a guest who's trying to do some research on the work.
We were really interested in what difference does it make if our field education groups do scientific research or not. And we thought it was about time that we try to measure the impact of this and see, one, is it working? And two, how does it compare to other possibilities that we have? And so really the question we asked is, what difference does it make if visiting mostly middle school students do inquiry-based research as part of their time here?
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
And Brian and I just got back from the Atlanta conference, the National NSTA conference, and we just wanted to put it out there. Everybody that we met at the conference, people that we met that were listeners of the show, some of you were wearing the T-shirts. It was just wonderful to talk to you all, and we really kind of thank you for your support. It was fun bumping into you at different sessions and sessions that we led and things like that.
Well, actually, yeah, and we did an impromptu presentation because we showed up for a 3D printing presentation, and the presenter didn't show, and we don't know exactly why, and we hope the best for the person, but
yeah, no doubt.
I walked into the room and Dale's already up on stage going,
well,
how about we do some 3D printing?
You know, the thing is, that's what's nice about conferences like this. You get a group of people, they all have a common interest, so we're all sitting in the room looking at each other going, is this going to happen or not? And so I just said, does anybody want to learn about 3D printing? I have some slides. If we put all our heads together, we can come up with some ideas. So, yeah, exactly. We wound up doing a presentation at NSTA and didn't have one plan. So we kind of took it over.
Well, and actually, I got some ideas as well. There were some people talking in the audience that, I thought, I should try that too. So in any case, that presentation we will put in the show notes. So you can, if you weren't there, you can see what's going on. If you were there, thanks for putting up with us. It was fun though. And, you have an opportunity to present next year, right, Dale?
Yeah, we could do this legitimately next time by doing a session proposal. So session proposals for the 2019 National NSTA Conference, which is in St. Louis, are due. They're coming up really fast, April 16th of 2018. So you can get those in and present at a national conference. And it is a lot of fun. We have presented in the past when we were actually on the schedule. So it is a lot of fun. I think
we'll do it this next year too.
Yeah, we're going to try to.
I will put the proposal link on the website for Lab Out Loud in the show notes. And of course, also at laboutloud.com, we host all of our catalog, I guess, of all of our last episodes, all of our previous episodes there. And it's important to remember that because we are getting into part 2 of this 3-part series on place-based education. So if you haven't listened to that episode first, you may want to go back and listen to that, where we talk with guests Greg and Ethan that introduce us to place-based education. They tell us a little about what it is and give us some examples and how it might align to science standards that way. So if you haven't listened to it before you do that today, go back and listen to it before you dive into today's episode.
Yeah, that would be episode 183, right?
Mm-hmm.
So today's guest is actually here to continue our discussion about place-based education. He's going to give us a look at his experience with place-based education.
But basically, the way I define it is that you're linking the classroom and the community together, and that learning for your students is embedded somehow in their place. And that could be, as a science teacher, I often focus on the kind of ecological or the science component of their place. But
meet Kevin Krasnow from the Teton Science Schools in Jackson, Wyoming.
I usually describe myself as an ecologist and educator, and I'm really kind of a hybrid of both. My career started as an educator, kind of in the informal context. I taught or instructed courses with Outward Bound for a number of years, and that was really kind of the foundation of my learning how to be an educator. And from there, I went on to kind of seek a longer interaction with students. Long Outward Bound courses is a month or so, but I wanted to obviously know my students longer. I went into classroom teaching. I taught high school for 5 years in San Francisco in the public school system, which I really enjoyed, and it was super challenging, but really, really rewarding. I knew I really enjoyed education, and I was really honing in on teaching science. And I realized, I'd be a much better science teacher if I practiced science myself. And so I went back to graduate school and studied forest ecology, specifically kind of fire ecology was my focus. And I did a master's and then a PhD in forest and fire ecology. And then I got hired on as my position here is research and graduate faculty here at the Teton Science Schools. I teach ecology courses at our graduate program. And I do research on educational research and ecological research with kind of the other hat that I have here at the science schools. And it's just a great mix of both science, teaching about science, teaching about teaching science, and then taking a step back and trying to understand effective science teaching and trying to understand, the ecology, specifically fire ecology of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So it's been a really good fit for kind of my broad interests, and it keeps me challenged and busy, both teaching and teaching about teaching, and then researching about teaching and researching about ecology. It's been wonderful.
Wow, it sounds like you've really let your passions drive where you are today. Can you tell us a little bit of what is the Teton Science School? I mean, obviously I can put together Teton National Park and science and school, but what is it?
Yeah, well, first off, it's Teton Science Schools. It's plural, and that most people don't realize that. It started as the Teton Science School 51 years ago. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year in 1967 by a guy named Ted Major, who was a high school science teacher, and he realized that he could really effectively teach about ecology and about science and the process of doing research in the out of doors. And he opened a campus in a corner of Grand Teton National Park for what was kind of a summer high school field ecology program. And actually, that's our longest running program. It's still running today. This summer will be the 51st year that it runs. And it's a field-based ecology course for high school students. And so our program really started as, what we now call field education. Which is mostly visiting schools, pretty much kind of K through college. We even have, Rhodes Scholars up here that are, retired. And so our students range from pre-K to 95 years old. And those are our field ed programs where students come and visit for anywhere from a couple days to a couple weeks. And we lead them in courses really focused on ecology and place-based education to really understand this place and learn some skills that they can bring back home to understand their own place and science.
I'm still in the pre-K to 95. I'm thinking the permission slips mean a whole different thing from one end to the next.
I guess you're right. Yeah. Most of our field ed programs are for younger students, but we do have a real vibrant adult education programs here as well. But that's just our field education program. The school has actually grown quite a bit, really in the last 2 decades, to incorporate the graduate program, which I mentioned. That's where half of my job sits. And so our grad program is really training in both field-based ecology, field-based science, but also teaching science, science teaching pedagogy with a real focus on field-based, outdoor-focused educational context. And so our students take both kind of courses in ecology and science, but many courses in pedagogy and kind of teaching theory and some of the nuts and bolts of designing a lesson and backwards design and whatnot. And then they do different teaching practica where they it's graded where they take more leadership as they go through the program, but where they design and implement courses and lessons for visiting schools. And their summer capstone is to design an experience and then teach an experience for one of our long-standing summer programs like that high school field ecology program that I mentioned. We also have a teacher learning center, which is kind of our professional development wing. So we hold professional development sessions for teachers around the practice and art of place-based education. We have a wildlife expeditions wing that is kind of vehicle-based educational tours, mostly for tourists in this area. And then we have 2 independent schools, Journey Schools, which is a pre-K through 12 international baccalaureate independent school, and then Teton Valley Community School, which is another independent school, which is kind of over the pass in Idaho. And so so now it's Teton Science Schools, plural, because it's a pretty complex organization doing a lot of different educational programs.
Wow. Well, as you know, we recently talked with Greg Smith and Ethan Lowenstein about what is place-based education and how it can fit into science education as well. So, Greg actually said, well, why don't you talk to Kevin? And he's got some great ideas about how he implements place-based education. And also you just embarked on a study about that as well. So how does place-based education fit into into Teton Science Schools as well as into your own instruction?
Well, I was thinking maybe first, how do you define it? We've heard Greg and Ethan tell us, but what's your view of place-based education?
Yeah, place-based education to me, and it's funny because, as I look back at my career as an educator, I find that, I've been doing place-based education for a long time, even though I've only had that specific moniker to kind of call it that,
Sure.
For the past, 5 years or so. But really place-based education is writ large, and the community or one's place you can look at, the ecology, economy, society, anything that's happening in that place, and really harness that as a backdrop for learning. And we feel strongly that place-based education, linking the classroom and community and students with their own place and their own communities, increases students' engagement. It increases their content knowledge, their understanding of what you're after, what you're teaching, and then it also increases their connection to their community and ideally their kind of positive impact on the community. And we think that all those things go really well together with the idea of integrating your curriculum with your specific place.
I think that's really powerful. I think about my days as the high school science teacher, and when we get to the ecology unit, that's kind of what it was. Is okay, we're going to tackle ecology now, but so much of it was disconnected from our own environment. If you go through the textbook, for instance, and I supplemented it with other things, of course, but so much of it was like talking about like case studies about, population studies and things like that. And, the closest we got was taking a look at like predator-prey models on Isle Royale. We're from Wisconsin, and so that's at least, driving distance away, but so much of our other experiences were, written in a book and kind of disconnected from students' lives themselves. How do you tackle that and saying, hey, let's go look at what's in our backyard, so to speak?
Yeah. So, and I can kind of answer that with two different hats on with, being an ex-classroom teacher, I totally understand where you're coming from, and that the curriculum in some sense has been made place agnostic, so that you could drop that textbook into any classroom in the nation, and that standardized curriculum, works or is works for that classroom. So I think for classroom teachers, it can be a particular challenge to become more place-based, especially with kind of high stakes testing and standardized curriculum. But as I think you insinuated, with some effort and some ingenuity, I think a lot of the content that teachers are asked to teach students can be engaged through local problems, local people, local ecologies. And so predator-prey relationship doesn't have to be on Island Royale. It can be, looking at your own backyard for some places and some students. So I think, the way that I go about it is to find out what is relevant in a particular place. Not all topics are going to be super relevant for any particular place, but every place is really interesting in many different ways. And I think the first step for teachers is just to learn more about where they live. And actually, we conducted a small study with a grad student who went on to get her master's from our program, and she looked at how coming to the Teton Science Schools and being exposed to place-based practices, how that affected teachers back in their own classrooms. And what we found is that teachers that knew more and learned more about place-based education actually engaged their communities more back at home. And teachers that had been teaching in the same place for longer and knew more about their community were more comfortable practicing place-based education. So, I would say for any teachers out there, the first thing is just to get to know your place and your community yourself. The more you understand about your place and the conflicts and the people and the kind of interesting things that are happening there, the easier it will be to engage your students and to pick those really relevant topics that your place really speaks to. Here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, ecology and science and geology are just right in your face here. And so our place really speaks to...
Can I use it as a title?
Those things. Sure.
No, science is right in your face here. But
yeah,
I kind of like that as like a little like theme for place-based education. Science in your face.
Science, it's right behind you.
I would argue that on any playground anywhere in the U.S., science is likely right in your face. You just need to look. You just need to look closely and see it. And I think interesting studies on insects and vertebrates and plants can be done virtually anywhere. And so, we understand our place is pretty spectacular, and people come here just to see the kind of nature and wildlife that we have here. But we also feel that any place can be special and can really serve as the backdrop for learning.
One thing I noticed is once you start thinking about place-based education, it's kind of like what you said. You've been doing it for a while. Now you had a name for it, but you start noticing it everywhere. And like in our own school district, I discovered that they had a whole website sort of housing community learning connections, and I'm like, this is kind of like the same thing here. It's pointing in the right direction.
Absolutely, yeah. And so whether or not it's called place-based education, I don't think is the important thing. But I think you're right. Opening your eyes to just the possibilities that exist within the community of the school, the place of the school, to get the students maybe outside of the classroom, interacting with other community members, other organizations, trying to make some positive difference in their community or to better understand some problem that the community is having. I think those are really the low-hanging fruit to making place-based education a reality in every school and every classroom.
It's interesting because, at least in our neck of the woods, and I think in many schools across the nation, we've made some strident efforts to keep the community out of our schools with increased security and other things like that. But what you're saying, actually, we want to encourage the community it's a reciprocal thing. We want community to come into the schools as well. So, in what you're mentioning, you need some experts and you need some community input as well to really pull this off, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, obviously having a teacher being knowledgeable about the opportunities, the appropriate places and people to talk to is really key. But without a cooperative community or connections outside of the classroom, you're much more limited in the scope of what you're able to do. And in my experience, community members are really excited about getting involved with the school, about helping students, about mentoring students, and they're really excited about what the students can potentially bring to whatever they're passionate about. And I mean, that's, I think, another thing to think about is think about the power of all these students working for, rather than working really hard on a lab experiment or a paper in their class, they're working really hard to either better understand or make a positive difference in their community. And they're learning a lot of really important content and skills along the way. And that's, I think, where the skilled educator can scaffold these things and design these things to be not only integrated with the community, but really powerful learning experiences for students.
I also think there's got to be a lot of carryover into other disciplines as well. And again, and from our experiences, we've seen a lot of push towards ELA and math. And then kind of science gets the back seat. But part of me wants to say science needs to be part of that springboard where students can be, I guess, motivated to use those skills in ELA and math to come to fruition there. So would you say that your experiences are more science first and then they kind of like blossom with other disciplines?
Well, I would go even a bit further and say, any really well integrated place-based education module or curriculum is really likely to be interdisciplinary. It's hard to just keep it science, and in fact, that's not ever, I think, a goal. But I think one of the great powers engaging with place and community is that one question leads to another, and just by the very nature of the complexity of real life, things get interdisciplinary really fast. And I see that as a strength rather than an impediment. But yeah, I could see how, you could use the scientific method to understand a social problem, or to understand, or to use, ELA or math skills integrated into maybe an inquiry of, transportation in your community, or food security in your community, or, an unlimited list of potential topics that would be, different in different places, but that skilled educators can kind of harness the real power of their place to engage students.
So you've actually done a little bit of research into place-based education, right?
Yeah. And so we, and then this gets back to kind of more of the science focused, but we were really interested in what difference does it make if our field education groups do scientific research or not. We've been doing kind of inquiry-based, mostly ecology-focused research with student groups for many, many years. And we thought it was about time that we try to measure the impact of this and see, one, is it working? And two, how does it compare to other possibilities that we have for visiting school groups? And so really the question we asked is, what difference does it make if visiting mostly middle school students do inquiry-based research as part of their time here? And we basically compared that to two other treatments. We had an inquiry-based treatment where students did kind of, what has been the science school's bread and butter is to facilitate, student-driven, inquiry-based research around our natural place here, mostly around kind of ecological phenomena here in Jackson Hole. And we compared that to a citizen science project where they contributed data, they gathered and contributed data to a larger scientific study that we have ongoing here at the science schools around fire ecology and forest ecology. And then the third treatment was no research at all. And this is what the school district had been doing for close to a decade. As they were coming here, they were doing a full day of an adventure hike, which is, again, another great experience for students to have. But in this case, we could compare, and it was a week-long experience for 3 sets of students, 3 consecutive weeks, all from the same school district. This is one of our largest clients. They bring almost 400 students each summer. And, the first treatment just did the adventure hike. That was as they had done it in the past. And we just modulated 1 day of this 6-day experience. These students did an adventure hike. The next week, that 1 day was an inquiry-based field research project that instructors kind of mentored students through. And then the third treatment, the third week, was a citizen science-based research project where they really didn't have choice in what they were doing. We had designed a data collection protocol where students were coring trees and collecting tree cores to contribute to a larger kind of fire ecology, forest ecology project that we had ongoing.
Okay, so there were some common themes that went through all of this study, correct? You all did some components about, going to Yellowstone National Park, canoeing. Your fire ecology comes into play, and also glacial geology, which is something that both Dale and I hold dear to our hearts here in Wisconsin.
Yeah. So each of these kind of treatments, so to speak, were 6-day trips out to the science schools where all of the students engaged in. They went to Yellowstone for a full day. They went canoeing in Grand Teton National Park. They did some glacial geology and fire ecology up in Grand Teton National Park. So all the programs had those components. And then the one component that we modulated was just whether or not the students did research, and if they did do research, whether it was kind of an open inquiry project or I'm going to call it a contributory citizen science project, recognizing citizen science is a large realm of activities. And what we did was a very narrow slice of that where the students collected data and submitted that to a larger study. And so that's kind of contributory citizen science rather than collaborative or co-creative.
So what were your results now? You had the adventure hike, the inquiry-based model, and then the participatory citizen science. What did you find?
Yeah, so we had some really interesting results. So just to back up a little bit, what do we measure? First off, we
Sure.
created an assessment instrument that was basically, fairly simple. It was a pre-post survey design where the students took basically were asked the same questions before their course, and then on the very last morning of their course, they took the same survey, and we looked for any changes within the individual. We could match an individual student's pre-survey with their post-survey, and then we looked for significant growth in the areas that we measured. And we really measured three different areas. We measured their attitudes about science from a pre-existing assessment tool that just measures how positive they're feeling about science, how well they think they can do in science. We measured self-efficacy is kind of what I'm calling it, but this really gets at how comfortable they are working with others and collaborating with a group, how they feel as a leader of a group, and how well they can incorporate many voices and diversity into kind of their leadership style. So that's self-efficacy, attitudes about science. And then the third area that we focused on was understandings of the nature of science. And this comes from the next generation science standards. It's actually kind of hidden in appendix, but we thought it was really interesting. It's just really around the nature of science as a way of knowing, different from other ways of knowing, but how they understand how science works and what are the underpinnings of the knowledge that science accumulates over time.
And how many students were surveyed?
So we had right now, after 2 years of study, we have 406 students over the 2 years that we have both pre and post tests for. And again, that differs slightly, question to question, but it's around 400 students that we have. So we have a fairly large sample size, and we have 2 summers of data at this point, and we'll gather another summer of data in 2018.
All right. So you're still in the middle of this study, so any results are maybe preliminary?
Yeah, we definitely have some preliminary results. And, interestingly, both of our summers they didn't show the exact same numbers, for each question, but they showed very similar patterns. And the patterns that we saw is generally that the open inquiry treatment led to the most positive gains across all 3 of these categories, which was interesting. The category that showed the least gains across all 3 of these categories and for both of these years of the study was the citizen science treatment. And again, we couch that as the contributory citizen science experiments where the students really just gathered data and submitted it to a larger project. The adventure hike showed significant gains, but not as much as the open inquiry treatment.
Okay.
And if we break it down by the different kind of categories, it's pretty interesting. For attitudes about science, the inquiry-based treatment was the best, hands down. That showed both years. In terms of self-efficacy, the ability of students to work well with others and to lead a group, the inquiry treatment was the best, but followed shortly by the adventure hike. And that's really where the adventure hike shone, was in this self-efficacy area, because the students are kind of spending a lot of time together, working together quite a bit on that hike. And then the nature of science understanding, that's the one category where the citizen science was really focused on data acquisition. That one kind of came out as the best, showing the most positive gains. But when we look at all the categories together, we see that the inquiry treatment, open inquiry treatment, really is outperforming both the nature hike as well as the citizen science experience. And kind of what I think is happening there, and again, this is my interpretation of the data. I've just told you what the results look like.
Yeah, why do you think that is? I just want to do an adventure hike. Why can't I do? No, go ahead.
Well, and I think, and this is, I guess I want to be real careful with these results. What I'm not saying is that an adventure hike is not worth doing. So we saw some real positive gains on the adventure hike. Likewise, I think citizen science can be a really powerful learning experience. But what we did was a small slice of what's possible. So what I think is happening here, the degree of student-centeredness is really different between the citizen science project we did and the open inquiry investigation. Absolutely. The citizen science was really a dictated procedure. We were teaching them how to use a new tool, which was an increment borer to take a core out of a tree. And the students really had fun with that. But we were asking novices to gather some data for us, and they didn't have a lot of input into what they were doing or how they were doing it. So I think they learned some things, but it wasn't. It didn't come out with the same positive gains, especially in attitudes about science and self-efficacy, that the inquiry treatment did, where they had much more choice and they worked more closely together with their peers. And I think that the student-centeredness piece of the open inquiry, kind of giving them choice about what they want to investigate, what they're interested in, how they might design methods to determine what's happening out there in the natural world. Those pieces of the scientific method I think are critically important for learning, and they weren't present in our citizen science treatment because it was really, we kind of dictated here's how to do this. So I think they learned some things there, but according to what we measured, the inquiry-based treatment really had higher student-centeredness and came out above the others in learning outcomes. The other two things I think are important. One is kind of the engagement in the process of science, and that's really what the adventure hike is missing. They're not really engaging in the process of science there, and that's that's not what they're supposed to be doing on an adventure hike. And so I think engaging students in the process of science, we see that both of the kind of treatments where they did science lead to more gains in the nature of science understanding or attitudes about science. So I think that engagement in the process of science is really important. And then another difference between the treatments is kind of the level of communication and teamwork that was needed to be successful. And actually, both the adventure hike and the inquiry-based research, they had to work pretty closely with their team to either develop questions and a method and to gather data, or to be successful in staying together as a group and exploring a new area, challenging themselves physically and socially to do this kind of difficult task together. And I'm talking about the adventure hike there. Whereas in the citizen science treatment, we had each student core a tree, and they kind of were in pairs to share a tool, but it wasn't as necessary that they collaborate or work as closely with their teammates. And so I think across those three different kind of domains, these treatments were pretty different. And my intuition, and again, this is my interpretation of data, is telling me that those three things really matter. And again, it's the level of student-centeredness in how much choice they have around what they're investigating and what they're interested in, the engagement in the process of science, and that what I would say is the more kind of steps of that scientific process that they engage in, the deeper is their learning. And then the level of communication and teamwork that was required in the treatments were also different. And I would say that, what we see in terms of positive gains in self-efficacy really relate to those treatments where they did need to work more closely and communicate more effectively with their team members.
Yeah, well, no, thank you. It's interesting because, of course, in terms of measurement and setting up your parameters for the project, you kind of have to isolate these things, but in reality, that's probably not the way you see science instruction happening. We don't just see, we're only going to be doing adventure hike science to, this whole semester, or we're only going to be doing inquiry based, or we're only going to be doing, and I would imagine that citizen science is still not quite there for a lot of teachers, but you're not just doing one mode, but you're probably switching up here and there, or mixing and matching, blending all of those together.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that you make, and I think for immediate relevancy of this study, it really is around this informal based. We have a week. Where should we focus our time this week? Or we have one day during this 6-day long experience. Do we want to go for an adventure hike? Or do we want to do inquiry-based research, or do we want to interact with a scientist here that's doing another study that we could contribute to? And I guess our point is not that we should, there's one of these that's the best that we should always choose, but that we can have our eyes open more about the trade-offs between going for a venture hike, which is going to have some really great student gains, incorporated into it, but it's going to be different than spending that same day doing an open inquiry research project. And I think for classroom teachers, I think there's still something to kind of be drawn from this research about how they do research in their classrooms, how they structure it, how they might engage with pre-existing opportunities to do citizen science on pre-existing studies. really how they structure their time, because there are trade-offs depending on what you're going to do. And for like a classroom teacher that's got a couple field trips a year, or some limited opportunity to engage in informal learning contexts, I think that the knowing kind of what the trade-offs are is really important.
Well, before we let you go, thanks again for sharing with us, Chris.
Yeah,
and I also know these are still preliminary results. You're still collecting more data on it, but what's next?
What's next? Well, yeah. So we want to continue doing this study, and what we're gonna add this summer is, in addition to the pre and post survey, which we're going to keep, we're going to add some. We have some grad student that we're working with, as well as some AmeriCorps volunteers, and we're going to add some observers in to observe the instruction and to document kind of exactly what's going on between these treatments and within these treatments. We also are going to hope to add some interviews of the instructors, as well as the teachers and chaperones, and possibly even some of the students, to really dig a little deeper and see if some of these assumptions we're making about what's going on really play out and are supported by what the students are saying.
So they'll be like third-party observers then?
Yeah, pretty much. This educational program is going on, and they've got a kind of a clipboard in the background, and they're just observing and making notes, and potentially even taking videos that could be reviewed later to look at both teaching practices as well as what the learners are doing, how the discourse unfolds, and what language is used, and really trying to document what's different between the treatments, what's similar, and can we link that to some of these findings that we're having.
Sure.
We're also interested in, this school district is now coming for a fourth week. They're going to bring an additional week of students to us. We're also interested in designing an additional treatment that is kind of still maybe citizen science based, but has more student-centeredness, gives students a little more choice, a little more say in what they're measuring or the methods, to really try to tease out, because we saw big differences between the inquiry treatment and the citizen science treatment. And that's really, it was a little surprising, and I'm really intrigued in it. And so we're interested in tweaking that citizen science treatment a little bit, or coming up with another treatment that's more student-centered, to see if if the results kind of follow with the student-centeredness, our hypothesis about giving students more choice and agency in what they're studying.
Well, fantastic. We look forward to seeing those results as well. Sound like you got your hands full for the summer then.
Yeah, we've definitely got our hands full, and this is just one research project, and we've got a number of others that we're hoping to do in the coming years.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Chris. We hope that you get some fantastic data, and again, like we said, we'd love to hear the final results.
Well, great. Thank you guys so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to speaking with you further myself.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.